our Mandala Dialogue, which is on national reconciliation and peace process in Myanmar. We have already organized these dialogues on many subjects related to our neighborhood. So today we are focusing on Myanmar. We have two distinguished speakers with us for the inaugural session. We have our keynote speaker, Ambassador Vijay Nambiar, former special advisor of the UN Secretary General on Myanmar. And we have a special invitee, Ambassador Vikram Doraiswamy, Joint Secretary, BM Division, MEA, Government of India. I welcome both of them to Nehru Memorial Museum and Library and to the 4th Mandala Dialogue. And without delaying any further, may I now request Ambassador Nambiar to give his address.
Thank you. You mean you have delayed already?
Yes.
No, anyway, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be here at the Nehru Memorial for this 4th Mandala Dialogue. I think I'll get straight into the subject. The subject is, of course, national reconciliation and the peace process. But if you ask people around the world, what is the subject that is engaging the attention of people around the world, the main issue relating to Myanmar today is the plight of the Rohingya Muslims in the northwestern part of the country, the plight of the people who fled in large numbers after the crackdown in October 2016 and again in August of 2017. You can't avoid talking about Myanmar without talking about this, so I thought I'll take it on right at the outset. The latest exodus of over 700,000, which is, I think some people even put it at 1 million, into Bangladesh has caused concern and indignation, and it is perceived, at one stage I had used the word to the Myanmar authorities itself, institutionalized discrimination. But since then, particularly after the events of 2016 and 17, words like ethnic cleansing and even the word genocide, the G word has also been used to refer to the treatment of this minority population in northern Rakhine. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who you probably all know was the UN High Commissioner for Refugees for 10 years, referred to the violence committed by Myanmar security forces as undoubtedly amounting to what he called the gravest crimes under international law. A UN fact-finding mission identified 6 generals and said that their behavior warranted investigation by a competent court that can determine their liability for genocide. Actually, the word genocide has been used for the first time, I think. Even people like Kofi Annan had not used the word, and I think most, certainly special advisors, have been very careful not to use this expression. But the panel even accused the country's civilian leader, Aung San Suu Kyi, of abetting such crimes. And important countries like the US, EU, Canada have imposed sanctions against specific Myanmar officials. Just a few weeks ago, in fact, the UN announced the appointment of a head, a US national, Nicholas Koumjian, as the head of an investigative mechanism. What is this investigative mechanism to do? It's to help build a comprehensive anti-impunity strategy to provide processing, analytical, legal help from international quarters to the national authorities, as if Myanmar is going to accept that. But anyway, it was something that was mentioned. Now, how did this Rohingya crisis become such a major issue? Was the magnitude of this humanitarian tragedy something that we did not see coming? Will, in fact, this new wave of hatred result in atrocities, further atrocities on lines of the Pol Pot, Cambodia, or the issues like in Srebrenica or in Rwanda? And how could the democratization process in Myanmar have brought this kind of a result? This is a question which most people are asking, and I suppose I shouldn't be asking. I wouldn't be surprised if all of you are not surprised, because it is really quite, anybody who's been into Myanmar and has seen the issues would have seen the Rohingya question as something that has been festering for decades, if not generations, over the years, since perhaps even before the war, when, perhaps after Burma separated from India. A few years ago, just to put this, I think it's important that we see this issue from a slightly different perspective. A few years ago, the Asia Foundation had made a study of Myanmar's ongoing sub-national conflicts, whose findings are still very relevant. I think it's important that we put that in perspective because that shows the proportionality, as it were, of all these facts. Some of the pertinent facts which the Asia Foundation study said, I'll put this down. Even today, they say, 118 of Myanmar's 330 townships are affected to some extent by conflicts and associated tension between government and ethnic armed organizations. And these townships, 118 townships, contain more than 12.3 million people. 1/4 of Myanmar's population, in other words, have been jujawing, as it were, have been involved with this ethnic conflict since independence. Ethnic armed groups, including those who have signed bilateral ceasefire agreements, are present in 94 of these townships. Around 40% of them have experienced armed clashes despite the agreements, and they continue to do so. The military, or the Tatmadaw, is estimated to number around 250 to 350,000 people, but they have 23 former non-state armed groups working as border guard forces who are separate from the army. Over 20 independent ethnic armed organizations exist in Myanmar of varying size and influence, of which the largest 5 groups are thought to have over 5,000 armed combatants. They run their own civilian administration, offer health, education, and other public services in their area of influence. From Burma's independence up to the current peace process, all 7 major efforts to negotiate a nationwide ceasefire of the subnational conflicts have failed to produce lasting settlement. I think the most promising was the last one. And in some ways that is different even in quality from the earlier ones. Just a few weeks ago, in fact, you've had news of the army using helicopter gunships to attack the Arakan army in northern Rakhine, and which resulted in substantial collateral damage. Now, how are these subnational conflicts in Myanmar different from those in other countries? Some of the things I mentioned earlier are themselves self-evident. In most Asian countries, the affected regions affected by subnational conflicts are small in proportion to the national population. On an average, they say just about 6.5%. Now, in Myanmar, 11 of the 14 states and regions are affected, and as I said, 1/4 of the population is affected by conflict. And the areas affected are not just remote border zones. These areas lie within 100 kilometers of the national capital, Naypyidaw, or even the largest city, Yangon. They involve some of the most powerful non-state armed organizations in South and Southeast Asia. The United Var State Army, for example, can mobilize up to 30,000 troops. Now, even the global average duration of subnational conflicts in the world is 16.8 years, apparently, according to the foundation. In South and Southeast Asia, it is 45 years. In Myanmar, particularly, the longest subnational conflicts have lasted 66 to 70 years. Now, what are we talking about? So this is really the situation. It's the state of nature in Myanmar, as it were. Now, what is the key implication of this kind of a situation? It is the army's claim to play a strong role in buttressing the Myanmar state. There's a self-evident rationale for the army's argument that it will control the state. It'll take control of all the major elements of security policy in the state. And that's exactly what has been happening. Over the decades, the army has made clear its determination to ensure the preservation of the security of the state, safeguard its national unity, and maintain its role as the ultimate custodian of state power. Obviously, they talk of the three national causes, this disintegration of the Union, non-disintegration of national solidarity, and the perpetuation of sovereignty. And this has served as the bedrock of the security policy of the country. Now, obviously in the future too, the army will not allow any derogation of its role and status even under the 2008 Constitution, either in terms of its 25% participation in Parliament, its control over the important security departments, or its relative predominance in the National Security Committee, unless the political and national reconciliation process in the country reaches a state of stability and consolidation in its own assessment, not in somebody else's assessment. Now, let me say a few words about the UN involvement in Myanmar. Ever since 1990, May, in fact, even the year before that, when the events, the army's takeover took place, all the way up to 2016, the UN has been adopting every year what they call a naming and shaming resolution, calling for the restoration of democratic civilian government, deploring the grave human rights violations, calling for the release of political prisoners and for the protection of ethnic and minority rights. This was accompanied by the UN's virtual, in a sense, acceptance in terms of all the activities of the major agencies, funds and programs of the Western imposition of sanctions against the country. It was only when Cyclone Nargis struck in 2008 that this scenario began to change. Secretary Ban Ki-moon's 2 visits to Myanmar led to the setting up of a tripartite core group coordination mechanism with ASEAN and Myanmar, of course, to address the consequences of the cyclone, which was, of course, one of the worst to affect Myanmar, perhaps in history. And this action paved the way for reducing a little bit of the mistrust between Myanmar's ruling junta and the outside world, particularly with the UN. And in some ways, I think the UN found a way to change from its earlier finger-pointing against the army to an approach of positive reinforcement, engagement, and support for reform, which was the 7-point program which the army had suggested, and which was more in keeping with the ASEAN approach as it was evolving at that time, rather than what was the Western approach supported by a large number of countries and expressed in annual resolutions against the Myanmar regime. Now, in line with the new constitution, which was promulgated in 2008 constitution, the referendum of which took place immediately after Cyclone Nargis. General elections were held in 2010, and as I was mentioning to my colleague in my first conversation with Aung San Suu Kyi, after her release, she talked about the parody of democracy being much worse than an outright dictatorship. The UN at that time was not willing to call what was happening then a parody. They said that it is flawed. Publicly we'd stated that it's flawed, but it is at least an effort to move towards democracy. And from that point of view, it was called, I think U Thant Sen called it a disciplined democracy. But it was a movement in the direction of democracy. And under President Thein Sein in 2012, he did succeed in changing the mood and tenor within the country, encouraging an open and relatively active parliamentary process, certainly increased freedom of expression and assembly, a large number of releases of political prisoners, a strong local media, and an active role for the opposition parties, which was expressed in the Aung San Suu Kyi herself agreeing to participate in the by-elections, etc. And it looked as countries which had previously imposed sanctions against Myanmar began to pay fresh attention and pump up to about 5 billion into the economy, it appeared that they were trying to, in a sense, try to fill out some of the space previously occupied mainly by China during the decades of stagnant growth and during the time when the sanctions were in place, which had given China, in fact, a major space in the economy. Now, from the government's perspective, the most important priority for the U Thein Sein government was to end the 60-year-old civil war. And to this end, in August of 2011, President Thein Sein, in his first official overture for a nationwide peace process since 1963, invited all the ethnic armed groups who had been at odds with the government to secure lasting peace. This, in some ways, was a major display of political will by the government. It was different from previous efforts at peace, because previous efforts were actually aimed at having arrangements with the heads of the various to virtually to allow them to rent seek in some ways and help elements in the army also to have a modus vivendi through which they were able to exploit the mineral resources of those areas. In fact, it was not really an effort to reach out to the people and to engage in actual power or resource sharing arrangements. The promise to have a political dialogue was also made for the first time by President U Thein Sein, as was the reference to federation, a federal setup. These were all new from that point of view. And in that sense, the Thein Sein government could be seen to have been trying to make a genuine effort to launch and to move the peace process on. A ceasefire and then a political dialogue. Even his selection of negotiators, in fact, in a sense, reinforced this feeling. And from my own personal experience, I can say that there seemed to be a fair degree of trust between the government negotiators on the one side and the ethnic armed organizations, even though suspicions remained, and particularly some of the major ethnic groups of the north, Kachins and others, were unwilling to move until they received clear assurances on the ground and in terms of commitments by the government, which had not yet been received. And eventually, when the NCA itself was signed in October of 2015, it was short of the kind of assurances which that the government wants. But at the same time, one must say that to get back to December 2012, the outbreak of hostilities, especially in Kachin, resulted in spillover of the fighting in Chinese territory, and that for the first time brought the Chinese, not for the first time, it brought the Chinese substantially, and they sort of brought the ethnic armed groups as well as the army to talk. And there were 2 rounds of dialogue held in Roili. These meetings were under direct Chinese aegis. While the meetings did succeed in calming the situation, I think it embarrassed the new civilian government considerably. I was on a visit during just after the second meeting in Roili, and I had occasion to actually go to Lashio and welcome the Wu Ong Min, who was the main negotiator in Lashio, and then sit with him in the aircraft going to Naypyidaw. And in fact, he told me frankly that both the government and the ethnic groups were uncomfortable to be discussing their differences on Chinese soil under Chinese aegis. They would prefer to continue negotiations inside Myanmar. And while keenly aware of the Chinese interest as a neighbor and as a strong supporter of the military government, they were nevertheless strongly insistent, both sides this, he said, in these talks taking place under national ownership as well as with the need for some countervailing presence to that of China. He mentioned that to me directly. And at that time, before that already I had seen from the Kachins whom we had been meeting at various levels in their leadership. The Kachins particularly were keen, and they were in some ways spearheading they were taking the lead in the negotiations that led to the formation of what is called the NCCT, the Nationwide Ceasefire Coordination Team on the ethnic armed group side. They were insistent initially that the peace talks or the ceasefire negotiations be witnessed, or observers to this negotiations, international observers, should include the US, UK, China, UN, and perhaps even others. Obviously, the Chinese were not inclined to that, and eventually it appeared that the Chinese were willing to accept the UN along with China as observers. And this is what Wu Wangmin had pressed, and he asked whether it would be possible for the UN to extend its good offices, particularly the good offices' role in observing the peace process. I was able to speak to the UN, to the US and the UK, among others in the P5, and to obtain, as it were, their go-ahead for not being part of this process and allowing the UN. And I said that in all transparency, I would be giving them an idea of what was happening so that they would at least they'd at least have some information. But it was at that stage the UN was allowed to go, and I think the presence of the UN did make a difference, and if anything, the Chinese observers were able to make the kinds of soundings in their advice to the various ethnic armed groups as well as to the government, which broadly followed the pattern which we had suggested, which the UN had suggested, and which was acceptable in a sense broadly to the international community. Now, in the process, as it were, I think for the first time, the nationwide ceasefire coordination team, which was formed of the 8 ethnic armed groups, did evolve surprisingly, despite the differing and diverse kind of interests of each of the armed groups. They were able, and I was present even at some of the ethnic armed group so-called summits at Lokilar as well as in Liza and in Maijayang, to see them evolve a common position. Of course, there were hardliners and there were softliners among the armed groups, and it was clear that right up to that time, right up to almost the last election, the KIO spoke in more than one voice. And it was possible, on the one hand, that negotiators were willing to reach arrangements for that eventually resulted in the text of a nationwide ceasefire agreement being arrived at. At the last moment, because of the inability at the higher political level of the KIO to agree, they stepped back, as did some others, and there was really a signature of only, I think, 7 armed groups in March and then October of 2015. But on the government's part, in February of 2015, at the 68th anniversary of the signing of the original Pangnung Agreement, which was their, of course, National Union Day, President Thein Sein signed what he called a deed of commitment, where he actually, in writing, promised to form a form of federalism for the country. And this was done in the presence of vice presidents, speakers, union ministers, and 55 political party leaders. Now, and of course 3 lieutenant generals. Now, this was more than just a symbolic kind of event. Though the government had hoped to sign a national ceasefire by that date, actually the ceasefire was eventually signed in about 5 months from that time. And a large number of international observers were also present. The USA, EU, most of them were present and widely welcomed this. Now, unfortunately, this signing of the ceasefire became actually a partial signature. Many of the others did not participate. But nevertheless, it was followed by a joint monitoring committee set up. And in fact, by January 2016, there was already a first session of the Union Peace Process, which is a peace conference, which is formally opened in Naypyidaw. So it looked as if there was a movement towards a political dialogue. Of course, the army and the ethnic armed groups had major differences in terms of when it should start, how the political dialogue, how fast it would move. The major difference being the army continued to insist that there should be what they called DDR, that is disarmament, demobilization, beforehand, whereas this was something which the ethnic armed groups would just not agree to. Because they said, unless we are sure what kind of a political deal we are coming, it's not possible for us to give up our armed our option to fight, as it were. And they talked about, on the other hand, they talked about security sector reform. So there was a bit of a kind of a difference of interpretation in how this process of gradually joining the political process rather than continuing the military option, how that would be pursued and how the state should go on. Now, meanwhile, there were persistent tensions among some of the armed groups which were not present, partly with the under the KIO, that is, some of the Kokang, the MDNA, the DWA and others had not participated. And tensions in Kokang particularly reached a stage where the beginnings of the Northern Alliance began to be seen actually in early 2016 itself. While, therefore, the first Panglung agreement, first Panglung, 21st century Panglung conference took place just before the new government of Aung San Suu Kyi took place, she attended, and in fact, that gave a kind of credibility and legitimacy to the process. The new negotiating team which she set up didn't have quite the credibility which the earlier team had, the earlier team under U Thein Sein. And to some extent, the lack of the hiatus between the army and the negotiating team of the NLD began to grow. And increasingly, you found that this kind of difference began to affect the willingness of the ethnic armed groups to continue the process with the government. And therefore, suddenly you found a difference, a hiatus, or a kind of a division between the armed groups as the Northern Alliance, as it were, and the others. The Karens, who had actually been holding out the longest, actually joined the process. But eventually you find that over the last few months particularly, even the Karens are feeling dissatisfied and moving away, and the RCSS, which is the Shan groups, also are moving away. Internecine conflict has also started between the TNLA and the RCSS. And the interesting new development since taking over by the Aung San Suu Kyi of the peace process, she had promised to have at least 3 more Panglung meetings. The second and third took place, but the fourth has not taken place as yet. And there is a kind of a change even in the configuration, as it were, on the ethnic armed group side. An entirely new phase seems to have come about with the more direct involvement of WA, and with in a sense, by the end of 2016, the UN, for a variety of reasons, moved out of this process. And I think the new government was less willing to accept the United Nations to be part of this process of the peace dialogue. And particularly after the Aung San Suu Kyi's visit to China, the new Chinese, in a sense, he's not new, he was there since 2015, Sun Guoxiang, he'd been fairly active, and he was able to move both the army and the new government to carry on the process, to push the peace process by getting many of the ethnic armed groups into Yunnan and have the same kind of repetition of the old Chinese aegis sort of quarreling, as it were, of the various armed groups in order to help the peace process. Whether it's going to help the peace process or hinder it was not very clear. And so, in a sense, you found that China became a player. There was no other player in the peace process, and it had interests which straddled both the ethnic armed groups as well as the government's interests. And one got the feeling it was playing the one against the other. And if at the peace conferences there was a show of intent on the part of the government to move forward, the army continued to, in a sense, heighten its attacks against the ethnic armed groups, and the ethnic armed groups, particularly the Northern Alliance, was not willing to join the peace process or sign the nationwide ceasefire agreement. The army insisted that if any of the groups was to join the peace talks, they had to sign the NCA. And clearly the WA, as well as the other four groups, were not willing to do this. So you reached a stage where new centers, the WA is actually has become a kind of a new center, and the Northern Alliance now seems to be, there are more discussions taking place in Yunnan and in Pangxiang, that is the capital of WA, rather than in the past from Myitkyina, which is the KIA and the KIO seem to have been the main sort of the leaders of the negotiation process. That lead seems to be slowly slipping away from the hands of KIA or KIO and going in the hands of the WA. And it is clear right from the start, in fact, at the meeting when the WA participated in, I think it was the second 21st century Pangnung, their leader had made a very strong statement saying that we are firmly interested in the BRI, in what you call the OBOR, and said that that should be the line through which the political motivation should be, because it will help both the ethnic regions as well as the main Myanmar government to move forward. So you can see that the influence of the Chinese the Chinese special envoy and of the Yunnan government in the process, the peace process, is now particularly strong. And in fact, one is not sure whether it's moving, whether it's becoming, in a sense, a subset of the larger let's say, the larger economic strategies of China for this particular region. According to a recent assessment by Mary Callahan in the Institute of Peace, U.S. Institute of Peace, on the forthcoming elections, her main focus was on the forthcoming elections, but she said that despite its vow to hold 3 more Union peace conferences before 2020, Aung San Suu Kyi's government appears to be foundering, having shepherded some 51 so-called federal sort of principles from the previous Union peace conferences. These 51 sort of principles were really restatements of existing constitutional features that are already there in the 2008 and laws that are already in the statute books in Myanmar. She says, no significant UPC debates have been allowed on matters of decentralization of authority or other matters of central importance to the signatory ethnic armed groups. The NLD is keen to leverage whatever sort of union peace accord it can pull together to present its parliamentary majority for ratification before the 2020 election. It looks like even that won't happen. The substance may stretch no further than these 51 principles and will garner even more resentment from the ethnic armed groups. Now, even the kind of people they have had on the negotiating team at the political level does not inspire the kind of confidence which the earlier team had. Unlike Thein Sein and his senior colleagues, including the principal government negotiators, who were convinced that the UN could play a constructive and balancing role, the NLD has somehow shown no interest in such a role. And as the process gets increasingly enmeshed amidst the diverse interests of the army and the ethnic armed groups, China's own BRI-related and other bilateral interest, including the resuscitation of the Mitsun Dam negotiations, it seems as if that is taking the front stage now. Okay, thank you. Now, I don't need to go very much in detail on the Chinese interests here, but I still think that there is still deep suspicion of a possible Chinese role, particularly within the army. And as it seems now, for political reasons, it looks like the civilian government of the NLD is more interested in pushing forward the process, mainly because of the substantial political support which China has been giving on the Rakhine and other questions, as well as within the Security Council, as well as the promise, obviously, of a major economic upgradation in the relationship with the CMEC and things like that, which is very important. At the same time, I think that China today is in a good position to exert its leverage with all parties. The equation in the national reconciliation discourse is changing in China's favor. While this is not likely to please the army, the Tatmadaw entirely, I don't think it is able to counter it. In fact, more recently, just a few days ago, the Commander-in-Chief talked about the eternal friendship of China. And of course, today, Dao Su is probably already in Beijing for this second BRI meeting. And they are thinking in terms of a large, I think there's some, 6 projects they're talking about. At the meeting, the ladies expect to finalize at least 6 major projects as part of the BRI. And of the 30 or so projects proposed, around 9 are already underway at various stages of a hiatus. Of course, both the army and the government are likely to respond in a positive and forward-looking manner to these ambitious cooperation projects with China. But I think the inability of the government to agree to any kind of countervailing presence, of course, the UN, I think, has lost its credibility, partly because of the grandstanding it has been doing, particularly on the Rakhine question. And so what earlier was practiced, at least I am not trying to justify my own stand, but I think it was during the time when I was Special Advisor, I had felt that it is possible for the UN to publicly not, at least you could adopt a two-legged approach. That is, on the one hand, the High Commissioner for Human Rights could, of course, sound the broad matters of principle, etc., publicly. But it was, I thought, inadvisable for the political side, the Special Envoy, to be publicly berating the government and then expecting to talk to it. So we had been following, and while the same message was conveyed privately to the government, we were able to reach out and talk with all parties, particularly with the army, without embarrassing them. The moment the United Nations forced even the political side, after the human rights upfront and other initiatives, to also speak and include words like ethnic cleansing and genocide, it was clear that the government could not be expected to then have a conversation, a constructive conversation with the UN. And the UN now being out of the show, I think it is important that some kind of a countervailing presence be there. And as far as I can see, there is really, for a country which is, in a sense, juxtaposed between two neighbors, if one neighbor is active, I think it is important that the other neighbor also at least be present and to show that it is able to provide some kind of a counterbalance. I'll just sum up with some 6 points, quickly. The expectation that Aung San Suu Kyi would become a catalyst for democratic institution building, I think, has remained unfulfilled. The NLD's treatment, in fact, of the other opposition parties like the 88th Generation and others actually shows little trust or confidence. Trust between the lady and the army does not seem to have developed. She realizes she can't challenge the power of the army, and she has avoided taking uncomfortable or unpopular action. But, in fact, I think she wouldn't mind scapegoating the army in many of these areas. And I think on the Rakhine particularly, she seems to have pushed it in that direction. The outside world is clearly frustrated by Dao Su's unwillingness to take effective action. And though the peace process and the Panglong conference is her first priority, I think neither she nor her main advisors seem to have made any serious effort to reach out or build a chemistry with the ethnic armed groups. As China takes on a role as principal external referee in the talks, there will continue to be doubts on both sides about hidden deals that China may have with each of them. The logic of an external balancing factor besides China is therefore, I think, still very much there. And this is where I think India could perhaps play a useful role. I think we need to work discreetly with the army, with the Tamadao, without getting into any overt competition with China, and without publicly questioning any of the motivations behind Myanmar's response to the BRI. I think we could also engage in infrastructural projects discussed and work with Myanmar both on the economic front and, more importantly, on the national reconciliation and the peace process front. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Nambiar. May I now request Ambassador Durai Swami to address us.
Sorry, I took a lot of time.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Nehru Memorial Library, for the warmth of your hospitality. A little extra right now. It is a particular pleasure to be here in the presence of my first substantive ambassador, Ambassador Nambiar. We served together in China long ago, and he can be held responsible thereafter for anything else that has happened in my career. And also Ambassador Seshadri, who one of the very distinguished predecessors dealing with the Myanmar account in the ministry. I'm particularly pleased that you've chosen at the Nehru Memorial Library the opportunity to talk about the Myanmar peace process. I think this is something that in India gets lamentably little attention, both in the national press but also in our policy discourse. And it is a matter that has significant and direct implications for us. So Ambassador Nambiar's excellent presentation, sort of to the table that he gave us on the peace process, is, I think, where he ended it, is an excellent segue point for me to start up, because I'm essentially going to talk about this, why the Myanmar peace process matters to us. Obviously, I'm particularly grateful to Ambassador Nambiar for having gone through the exercise of outlining the complexities of the peace process, because to spend in the next 5 or 7 minutes time to try and explain the peace process and its constituent bits to you would be reminiscent of what Woody Allen once said when he said that thanks to a speed reading course, I was able to read War and Peace in 1 hour. It's about Russia. I didn't want to leave you with a similar feeling at the end of this that I was talking about broadly Myanmar. There are 3 broad parameters that any discussion on Myanmar's peace process should focus on. And I will focus on the first one, which is namely, what does the Myanmar peace process matter to us? The second, of course, would be what is going on in the peace process, and finally, where will it go from here? And I won't go into the second one at all, except to make a few comments on the last point. At the outset, I think it is a significant mistake to assume that the Myanmar peace process is of no or limited relevance to India. Aside from the obvious fact that conflict in a neighboring country between unsettled ethnic minority groups and on our periphery has an obvious relevance to our security, there is also the larger fact that there are ethnic and other commonalities between our northeast and Myanmar's west and northwest. Historically open, unfenced borders with a long tradition of free movement across these borders, essentially between people divided by arbitrarily drawn lines during the colonial period, implies that there is an obvious security and human aspect to unsettlement, to coin a phrase, on India's periphery and Myanmar's periphery. The concept of unsettlement, or the lack of settlement, is something that I think is relevant for us to briefly consider, without getting into too much detail about it, I think it's valuable to consider the fact that in the peripheries of the British Empire, whether it was Afghanistan and the border with British India, or Myanmar, the border between British India and run from New Delhi, but British Burma, and indeed even parts of the India-China border are essentially common complexities of unsettlement. You have peoples living on the frontiers whom it was expedient for the colonial power of the time to leave them in a certain state of development and to manage the border and the frontiers through that process. Without taking that thesis too far, there are some obvious commonalities between these senses of unsettlement. Most of all, the fact that unsettlement essentially tends to percolate across borders. So you have similar problems and challenges that then happen, that manifest themselves on India's borders in the northeast with Myanmar's west and northwest. This also explains why conflict and insecurity have persisted across our borders in the northeast. Arguably, you could say that we've done better than many others in managing the problems of alienation and underdevelopment in our northeast, with wildly differing moments of sensitivity and lack of it in handling what are essentially problems that our own people are suffering. But if one is to make a comparison of these things, we've clearly done better than many of our other neighbors in dealing with these problems. That, in and of itself, coupled with the fact that the borders are soft and indeed structures are created to enable people to cross freely, including our free movement regime, which ensures that people on a 16-kilometer swathe of territory on either side can freely move across the border, essentially means that even if you do better comparatively in managing the processes of development and reduction of alienation on your own side, you're not going to get very far unless you deal with the similar problems on the other side of the border. And you cannot do it for somebody else. Therefore, you have a direct vested interest in what happens in peace processes there. There is a second tier of misconception that operates on with regard to the way we deal with these peace processes, which is essentially to look at this and say, well, the peace processes that Ambassador Nambiar, the groups that Ambassador Nambiar just enumerated, the ethnic armed organizations, are all, on the northeastern side of Myanmar primarily, and so therefore they are of limited relevance to us because they don't really have a particular conflict with us. Yeah, but now we do, of course, with the Arakan Army and all that, but the larger numbers, KIO, the Wa, Shan State, they're all on the far periphery of Myanmar. So we could and have in the past taken the approach that, these don't really impact upon our sensitivities, which again is a fundamental mistake because your lack of involvement with them also means they have no necessary buy-in to your security interests. Without being inimically disposed to your security interests, they are willing to do business, and business, I use the word advisedly, with Indian insurgent groups, either to provide them safe haven, to facilitate the movement of arms and ammunition, or to indeed offer them, to use them as conduits and via media, which has also tempted local formations of the Myanmar army from time to time. So this, again, is another reason why it is critical for us to recognize that what happens in the peace process there is of direct relevance to you, and your absence in any form from the conversation, you don't have to have a direct role, but your absence from the conversation means that your interests are not on anybody else's mind when the peace process is being talked about. There is a third layer of reasons which explains, which justifies or certainly argues in favor of our greater involvement, and Ambassador Nambiar alluded to this in a bit, which is that Myanmar's own interests in managing what is, in any sense of the term, an extraordinarily complex process in which some 30% of its population and perhaps an even larger chunk of its territory is involved in conflict. It necessarily requires multiple people to manage the complexities of this peace process. And evidence has suggested that Myanmar's ability to handle it in and of itself have not really been, shall we say, up to the mark. And its reliance, because of externally imposed factors on only one of its neighbors, has also been a challenge, both for the neighbor, to be fair, but also primarily for Myanmar itself. I think this is a factor that we also need to consider, because your own interests are also compromised if Myanmar has no other modality in which to manage its peace process. So, of course, how you intervene in the peace process is a different matter, and I'll come to that in a moment. But I think the critical part of it is that we need to consider, for our own domestic reasons, for Myanmar's domestic reasons, and for regional and international reasons, that every one of these factors argues in favor of greater Indian attention and indeed involvement in whatever way all three, the ethnic groups, the army and the Myanmar government, would have us play a role. Having said that, I'd also say that there is an important aspect. Of course, I'm speaking in this in my own capacity, but my own sense is that if India were to express a greater level of interest, and this should be manifested not just as government standing up one fine day and saying we'd like to do something, but the sort of thinking part of India, the Indian establishment, going out and paying more attention to these problems, looking at it not just as a Northeast problem, but as a problem for all of India, I would believe that you would get a positive response from all three sort of sets of parties to this dispute, to the domestic dispute in Myanmar, which is the EAOs, the army, and the Myanmar government. So necessarily being able to reach out more would be of utility to us. Insofar as where the peace process is going ahead, I think Ambassador Nambiar summed up much of it, so I don't want to take too much time on that subject. But I think it is important for us to recognize that the peace process is currently in a significant state of stasis. At the very least, it's stagnant. There are those, of course, who say it's actually regressing. There are a variety of factors that are attributable to it, and that can be attributed to it, and Ambassador Nambiar mentioned many of them. But I think it is critical here to understand that there is now a critical level of lack of trust between the ethnic armed organizations and the government, between the government and the army, and indeed between several ethnic armed organizations amongst them, inter se distrust. This is manifested in the breakout of conflict in Rakhine between the Arakan army and the Myanmar army, the marginalization of other Arakanese fighting forces, the recrudescence of fighting in parts with the RCSS and other parts of Shan state, and the general sense that there is need for some new ideas to come in and take the peace process forward. In this, and let me conclude with this final set of points, there are several steps that we can take, even short of direct and formal involvement in a peace process, which is currently, shall we say, in modest health. These include indicating to Myanmar that there are other alternatives open to it, rather than trying to bash everybody into one common frame, that through trial and error, what we have achieved in bringing ethnic armed organizations or insurgent groups in India to the peace process, indeed to power. The best example of which being the Mizoram peace process, where essentially the fighters of yesterday became the chief ministers of today, is an extraordinary achievement which has immediate local relevance to Myanmar. So the lesson that our federal experiment has offered, the lesson of our being able to take on vested interests within our own system and create new security forces to absorb demobilized fighters. And finally, the lesson that the democratic process has created in India to bring in diversity that indeed actually transcends anything that Myanmar has into a broadly coherent framework. You can argue at times when you watch television how coherent that is, but to a framework that certainly has relevance for Myanmar is something where we can have a unique input in Myanmar. And I'm happy to say that we're working with the Nehru Memorial Library in exactly this field, which is one of the reasons why Shakti Sinha Sahab is not here today. We've actually sent him off to Myanmar to give lectures on federalism to the Myanmar army, which he just delivered yesterday, if I recall correctly, along with a professor from Delhi University. The intention being we can play a role directly without necessarily getting into trying to broker ceasefire agreements and play a mediatory role between Myanmar and its Myanmar center and its ethnic peripheries. So there is a large volume of subcritical interventions we can come up with, for which it isn't enough if only government gets involved. It is critical that civil society, academia, and the larger Indian establishment needs to consider, purely as a matter of enlightened Indian self-interest. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will now break for tea, and we will come back after the tea break.
Before we disperse, can we request all the speakers, panelists and chairs to please assemble here for a group photo?
Okay. Yes, sir.